Good evening, everybody. I'm Trillian Atwood. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the JMM's Director of Public Programs and Visitor Services. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our virtual program today, People of the Futuristic Book, inspired by our exhibit, Jews in Space, Members of the Tribe in Orbit. For those of you who have been able to join us over the last few months for our virtual presentations, you'll know that we've taken some time to explore the literary side of space. From an exploration of Asimov to a discussion with sci-fi writers based in Maryland today, this seems to be an element of the exhibit in which many of us are able to make a connection. We should be dropping in chat right now a link so you can go and watch the recordings of those past programs. And today we wrap up this series with a broader discussion of Jewish involvement in science fiction writing with a trio of out-of-this-world speakers. So now to our speakers. Stephen Silver is a 17-time Hugo Award nominee and was publisher of the Hugo-nominated fanzine Argentus, as well as the editor and publisher of Isfik Press for 8 years. He has also edited books for Dor, Nesfa Press, and ZNB Books. He began publishing short fiction in 2008. His most recently published story is The Prediscovered Country. His most recent book is the anthology Alternate Peace, and his debut novel, After Hastings, was published in 2020. In 1995, he created the Sidewise Award for Alternate History. Stephen has maintained a bibliography of Jewish science fiction since the early 1990s and wrote the entry on Jewish science fiction for the Encyclopedia of American Jewish History. Valerie Estelle Frankel is the author of over 80 books on pop culture, including Hunting for the Meaning in The Mandalorian, Star Wars Meets the Eras of Feminism, and Superheroines and the Epic Journey. Her Hem for the Holidays was a PJ Library 2019 book. She's the editor of the Jewish science fiction and fantasy series for Rowman and Littlefield and is eagerly seeking books and essays on the topic. Once a lecturer at San Jose State University, she now teaches at Mission College and San Jose City College and speaks often at conferences. Michael Burstein, winner of the 1997 Astounding Award for Best New Writer, has earned 10 Hugo nominations and 4 Nebula nominations for his short fiction collected in I Remember the Future. Burstein lives with his wife, Nomi, and their twin daughters in the town of Brookline, Massachusetts, where he is an elected town meeting member and library trustee. When not writing, he edits K-12 science curricula. He has 2 degrees in physics and attended the Clarion workshop. So Stephen, Valerie, and Michael, it's over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Trillian. To get started, I think we need to start with the most basic question out there, and that is, when we say Jewish science fiction story, and when we say science fiction, actually, in the discussion today, we're going to be talking about science fiction and fantasy. It's just science fiction will be the term that we use as an overarching name. So when we say a Jewish science fiction story, what exactly do we mean? What makes a science fiction story Jewish? So Michael, I'm going to ask you to start.
Well, I'm going to also mention that we are going to talk about fantasy as well as being part of science fiction stories, but we also will talk about sort of the distinction, because there are Jewish science fiction stories and Jewish fantasy stories. And if you make a very simple distinction to think of science fiction technology in the future and think of fantasy, well, whatever, however, it's hard to define these things. But what makes a Jewish, there is a question, what does it mean for a story to be a Jewish science fiction story? Is an interesting question, because what I have found over the years of reading a variety of different types of stories that are Jewish in science fiction is that I know that Stephen, you'll probably want to talk about the 4 types that you have, I remember, mentioned and discussed, but I have often found that you're going to have 2 different types of stories out there. You're going to have a story or a novel that is primarily Jewish, sort of meant to have Jewish content with science fiction or fantasy elements in it, but it's kind of promoted and pushed as a Jewish story. Or the other side, which I think we're maybe a little more familiar with, is you have a science fiction story that the author or creator of it is part of the science fiction world, and may or may not be Jewish themselves, but has decided they wanted to explore some Jewish themes in a science fiction story. So my thesis is that you tend to have one that leans one way or the other, and that it's very rare to have something that you might necessarily consider, I can talk about that a little later, but the one thing I read that I once thought of as a completely Jewish science fiction. But that's this is my way of thinking. A science fiction story also becomes Jewish if you put Jewish elements in it. A Jewish story will be science fiction, put those elements if you put the science fiction elements in it.
Okay, and Valerie?
Agreeing with all Michael said, which was a lot of categories, and adding the obvious, I know it when I see it. If an anthology has a short story that's titled Goldie, Locks, and the Three Excaliburers, I am going to suspect, and it's by Esther Brazner, I'm going to suspect that it is giving us Jewish sensibility directing the fantasy. Or if somebody just says, I'm writing a Holocaust fairy tale novel, yeah, off we go.
Right. Okay, so Michael mentioned that I had come up with 4 categories of Jewish science fiction fantasy, and I did this several years ago. Let's discuss those and see where the conversation goes with those. The 4 that I came up with were, it's Jewish science fiction in name only. So it's a science fiction story, and the author peppers it with something Jewish. It could be a Jewish character who's not really intrinsic to the plot, but they're there. And yes.
Can I give an example?
Of course.
So I think like Pebble in the Sky by Isaac Asimov is one that I think we would fall into the category. The main character, if I remember correctly, his name is Schwartz. He finds himself in the future. He's like, from the 1950s or whatever. And throughout the story, he acts Jewish in certain ways, and it feels like he's supposed to be Jewish, but there's nothing about Judaism in the story. It's all about a man out of time in the future. Would that be sort of an example? If somebody wanted to claim Pebble in the Sky was Jewish, it would be sort of an in-name only type of story.
That's exactly the kind of thing that I was thinking of in those cases. The next one category is, it's Jewish for comic effect. And this, Valerie, you mentioned Esther's work. Mike Resnick did a lot of this also. And that is, it's a Jewish science fiction story. Frequently, it winds up being Jewish fantasy, actually, that feels like it came straight out of the Borscht Belt. It's there. It's a shaggy dog story. It just it puts itself out there as part of, it could be a home story, really. It's a Jewish joke. The third type is wish fulfillment. Now, in my introduction, Trillian mentioned that I founded the Sidewise Award for Alternate History, and I find a lot of alternate history stories dealing with the Holocaust fall into wish fulfillment. It's what if we beat Hitler? One of the wish fulfillment stories, though, that takes a very different take is Joel Rosenberg several years ago wrote a series, the Mitzada series. It's 2 books. I think there was a short story in there also about Jews in Space, the title of the exhibit at the museum right now, where Jews were the mercenaries that everybody wanted to hire because they were such good fighters. And that really, to me, is a science fiction story that's wish fulfillment. Joel wrote it, in the 80s, when there was a lot going on in Israel, so that's a Jewish wish fulfillment science fiction story. And the final category is to me the most interesting, and that is serious issues. And these are the ones that take the Jewish topics and really get down and explore what they mean. Michael, you've written several of those, I think. Before we go to you with those, we're going to ask Valerie about the ones that tackle serious issues.
Yeah, again, I'm gonna point to the fairy tale Holocaust novels, Jane Yolen in particular, Briar Rose, and The Devil's Arithmetic really used fantasy to explore the concepts and used fantasy as the vehicle to describe the Holocaust, and in one of the Devil's Arithmetic, used time travel to present the Holocaust to children, and it's as not Jewish and fantasy, but absolutely mixing those together as its point.
So, okay, and Michael, you've also used the Holocaust in your fiction.
I have back in 2000. I think one of my more well-known stories I published was Kaddish for the Last Survivor. It was actually inspired by reading Deborah Lipstatt's Denying the Holocaust, and she very graciously allowed me to quote from her book at the beginning, because in the preface of her paperback edition, she had mentioned, that one day we will lose our final Holocaust survivor, and will no longer be testimony that somebody can say this happened to me. And what's that going to mean for people to remember history? So I wrote a science fiction story in 2000 in which the last Holocaust survivor is dying. And I actually tried to explore not just the question of that, but also the question of a little bit of how that person interacted with their family, how what happens to his grown adult daughter and his wife. It was one of the, and by the way, this story is out on the internet. It's posted by Apex Publications has it, and I think the links will be provided later. But yeah, but I would say that's definitely, I mean, I consider that that's the weird thing. Is it a Jewish science fiction story? Well, there's science fiction in it, and it's set in the future. But I have to admit that I put one science fictional element in it to sell it to Analog, but I really think of it as more of a Jewish story. But yeah, it does fall under the serious issues concept that you have there.
Okay, so you consider that less science fiction, even though it's set in the future from when you wrote it?
Well, yeah, I mean, it had to be set in the future, but I consider it less science fiction than, let's say, I don't want to just focus on myself, but like the story I wrote, The Great Miracle, which I took the Hanukkah story and I turned it into a spaceships and planets and fighting aliens and I mean, the whole point of Hanukkah, of the Great Miracle story I wrote, was to end up with this little joke where they only had one fuel pod on the ship, but it lasted for 8 days. But that's also out there, but to be read. But that one I feel is much more really integrated Jewish science fiction. I don't know if I would call that a wish fulfillment. Maybe it's got a little of some of your mixes for comic effect or something like that. But yeah, it's hard sometimes to think of something that's going to necessarily be both. I mean, like when we talk about, for example, the wish fulfillment stories, I think of Isaac Asimov's story Unto the Fourth Generation, and I would suggest that Asimov is probably the most well-known Jewish science fiction writer even today, who's thought of in that way, even though Asimov himself was not a practitioner of Judaism. He also made a point of never denying that he had that he was Jewish. But his story Unto the Fourth Generation was the one story I think that he really thought about it as a Jewish story, where a person keeps seeing a name all over the place, and it turns out to be the name of his great grandfather, who on his deathbed got a wish to see what the life for his first son born in the new world, what kind of life he would have. And I think of that definitely as more integrated Jewish fantasy type of story.
Okay, so one of the things that you seem to be thinking is that it's almost like there has to be a certain percentage of science fiction or Judaism in a story. So, are we talking, and Valerie, feel free to jump in, does it have to be 50-50 or 40-60, or is having 5% Jewish content enough to make it a Jewish story? Is having 7% science fiction content enough to make it a science fiction story?
There are some where I would say just about 0% Jewish content still makes it a Jewish story. Where the Wild Things Are has no Jews in it, but you can just kind of feel the influence. Plus, if you've read the nonfiction it's really about his hairy, slobbering relatives covering him in kisses and saying they'll eat him up. Off we go.
Which also is a good point, and that is a lot of people who were raised Jewish, it's so integral to our essence, who we are, that we can't help but put it into whatever it is that we write or do or say. And I know that some people have said about Asimov, yes, you're not a practicing Jew, but you were raised a Jew. You were raised, with Jewish traditions, and therefore everything you do is Jewish. Valerie, in your book that's going to be coming out that we were discussing, you talk about, not necessarily, you talk about the Jewishness of certain entertainers, where there's nothing that you could point to and saying that's Jewish content, but if you watch it, that's Jewish content. And so you do wind up with that in some of the stories.
You're talking about sort of like it feels Jewish, which is hard. It's what Valerie said before. I know it when I see it.
Yeah.
No, I'm reminded of the story. This story Asimov used to tell in his or told in his autobiography, and I found out at one point that the person in the story turned out to be the writer and editor Josepha Sherman of blessed memory, had once said to Isaac, "Why don't you write about Jews? Why don't you have any Jewish characters in your stories?" And he apparently leaned forward and whispered to her, "They all are." And if you have a Jewish background and you read somebody like Asimov, I think you do start getting a feel for some parts of it that feel like Jewish culture. I mean, a lot of it feels like Brooklyn in the 1930s and 40s as well. The life that he knew there. But as you know, I mean, it's not. I mean, Asimov did not really focus on writing Jewish stories, whereas you have some writers who are Jewish, Jewish science fiction writers like Harry Turtledove, who has actually made a point of writing some stories that I think fall into one of your categories as something that's more than in name only. Harry, the story. Every now and then you have this sort of concept of someone has to write that story, like the Kosher Pig Story.
Yes.
Well, Harry did it. It was called
The R Strain.
The R Strain. Yeah. It appeared in Analog. It was just about genetically engineering a pig that has cloven hooves.
And shortly after it appeared in Analog, scientists said that they discovered a pig that was kosher, called the Babirusa. Turns out it wasn't, but for a while they thought that it might be. One of the things that I found when I was first building the bibliography was I was having people emailing me saying, "You didn't include this story." And I was looking and saying, well, yes, that's a Jewish author, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a Jewish story. So, that gets back, and we can all think of authors who are Jewish or Christian, and their belief system doesn't seem to infuse the story. It's a story that can be read, and it doesn't matter what the background is. So
I think what you sometimes have are Jewish science fiction writers who don't necessarily write Jewish stories, but they'll write something that everyone starts to identify as a Jewish story. I mean, I met the writer Philip Klass, who wrote under the name William Tenn years back, and I mean, everybody knows about Jewish science fiction, knows his story On Venus Have We Got a Rabbi, which is a very funny story. Has one of the best pieces of pilpul I've ever seen. I hope this audience knows what pilpul is. It's Talmudic reasoning, where a rabbi saves Passover by being able to figure out a way to declare an entire shipment of food to actually still be kosher for Passover on the planet Venus. But I don't know if Tenn really wrote anything else that a lot of people would point to as Jewish science fiction, even though, as you say, he was Jewish.
Yeah. And the converse is non-Jewish authors can write Jewish science fiction also. So one of the ones that, Valerie, you mentioned the other day when we were talking is Orson Scott Card. So
his Enchantment is Sleeping Beauty retold with a Russian Jewish family who are getting out of there. I think it was in the 80s. And absolutely, it felt perfectly Jewish. He'd done his research. I mean, I don't think it got to the point where they were eating kugel, but yeah, you could really feel the characters. And Dan Simmons also put well-researched Jewish characters in pretty much everything he wrote.
So is one of Dan Simmons having a Jewish character in it, does that make it a Jewish science fiction or horror story, or is it there for dressing?
Ish, because the Orson Scott Card, it's the main character, and Simmons, it tends to be a significant character, but you get farther and farther down. Is Buffy a Jewish story? Because once a season, Willow mentions that she celebrates Hanukkah. I think most people would say Buffy is not a Jewish series.
Okay.
It's interesting that you bring up a little bit of television there, because I think one of my daughters, and I've been showing the TV show Babylon 5 to one of my daughters. She's watching it for the first time. I saw it when it was first on. And you've got the character Susan Ivanova. I mean, you have a show that was created by an avowed atheist, but somebody who acknowledges all the different religions in the world as important. And you had an entire episode written by Larry DiTilio, who was Jewish, where this character sits Shiva. And they get almost everything right. And you know, to the point of having Theodore Beikel play the rabbi. I mean, you know, you've got to have Theodore Beikel on the show, right? But it doesn't necessarily make Babylon 5 a Jewish show per se. But I would say that that episode definitely did, did attempt to play up a Jewish theme in the story.
Right, but and you know, when I talk about stories that are Jewish in name only, relating this to TV, we've all seen the TV episodes that have the ostensibly Jewish character who, celebrates Christmas with everybody else because by that time they've forgotten that the character was Jewish, or maybe occasionally has a shout out and says, "Hey, it's Hanukkah, let's go trim the tree."
Or the worst for me, Stephen, is like when they want to do the Jewish thing. So, yeah, and they're a mystical fantasy show. So this is the episode they do the golem.
Yes.
I mean, I'm getting tired of it. Oh, it's a Jewish story because we have the golem in it. There's, yeah.
They never do Dybbuk's.
No, well, rarely. I mean, maybe the Dybbuk's are coming back or coming up, but there's so much more Jewish spiritual and fantasy stuff you could put in some of these things. Yeah, they don't always do that.
A couple Hanukkahs ago, Elena of Avalor did a very odd Sephardic and Ashkenazi mashup of Hanukkah. It wasn't offensive, but it was just quite a cultural mashup.
It was I like to call it like a noble attempt. It's like it's good. I understand what they're trying to do, but it doesn't quite all work here. I actually would like to bring up, because you asked, can a Jewish story be written by somebody who's not Jewish? And there is one story that was written by Joe Haldeman called the Mazel Tov Murders that actually I'm now going to mention the sequel for the original. I think that most people who are aware of Jewish science fiction are aware of the thing that's most well known in the field was a book called Wandering Stars that was edited by Jack Dan, which is basically a collection of Jewish science fiction stories. And then, and actually, I think the book's available for purchase from the Jewish Museum of Maryland. Maybe we'll find out about that later. But he also did this sequel called Wandering Stars 2. And Joe Haldeman had written this, I would say it's a Jewish story, the Mazel Tov Murders. And it got into the book, but the thing is, because it was in the book, and then you'll find this funny, Stephen, being the little guy who keeps track of these things, Joe Haldeman started getting put on lists of Jewish science fiction writers, even though he's not Jewish. and when I asked him about that once, he just kind of shrugged. He didn't really, it was fine with him, but if people could correct the record, that would be good too. But I would suggest to you that you could write, there is Jewish science fiction that's written by people who are not Jewish, but I'm not sure how to categorize it. Maybe I would call it, I might say it's Jewish themed fiction as opposed to Jewish fiction. I don't know. It's like
I think a lot has to do with what they do with it. Ted Chang, who's an excellent author. Most people probably know him now as the guy who wrote the story that the movie Arrival was based on. He wrote a short story called 72 Letters, which is based on Kabbalah and Gematria. And it's a wonderful story. And, Ted does it like Joe. Ted does his research. He gets everything in it right. And so you come away from feeling that you just read a very Jewish story that really was, went very deep into Jewish beliefs and Jewish tradition when you come out the other side of it. So I think that a non-Jewish author can write a Jewish science fiction story. Just like a Jewish author can write a Christian science fiction story or fantasy story. It may be a little bit more difficult because you have to do more research since you're trying to depict a culture that's not your own. But we're science fiction authors. When we write about aliens, that's not our culture either, or it's our culture, seen through a glass darkly.
I wrote a Catholic story. And to get the details right, I consulted with Guy Consolmagno, who is now the head of the Vatican Observatory. And he gave me a lot of details and helped me get things right. And the funny thing is, I've had most of the readers of the story who are Catholic read it and said, "How did you get all this right?" I had one reader on the internet who was Catholic who said, "I got everything wrong." Mm-hmm. And I showed that to Brother Guy, and Brother Guy laughed, and he's like, "Well, I think he said it was a very Jewish perspective that you'll get two different views on it. But
Yes.
yeah, I mean, I think you're right. You can have that Jewish story. That said, there is one book I want to bring up that I don't know how many people have read, and I was introduced to this book by a local friend named Jonathan Traum. It was a book called Planet of the Jews by a writer named Philip Graubart. I've never heard of him before or after. I think it was self-published. And it was the kind of book, when I talk about Jewish fiction that has a little science fiction, or science fiction has a little bit of Jewish fiction in it, this is like the book that to me was almost the pinnacle of Jewish science fiction, because it's about an editor who gets a manuscript from somebody who's clearly from the future, who tells this whole story about how the Jews fled Earth when spaceships were around and came to another planet and managed to settle on the planet. And you basically have two different stories being told. And the thing that I said about the book was that I actually enjoyed the book, but the way I recommend it to people, I say, this isn't a book to read unless you actually are in that intersection of wanting to read both Jewish fiction and science fiction. It's like I publish science fiction. We read science fiction stories that have Jewish elements to them that science fiction readers will read and love. There are stories written by Jewish writers like Isaac Bashevis Singer that have a fantasy element to them, and a lot of Jewish readers who would never pick up a fantasy novel will read the book and enjoy it. But this one particular novel, I felt he had really limited his audience in a way, which was a shame.
On the question of, is it fantasy with a little Jewish or Jewish with a little fantasy, or have we really achieved the 50-50? Some books overtly only have a small Jewish presence, like City of Bones by Cassandra Clare, the author is Jewish, that's pseudonym, has a hot teen Jewish vampire, okay. But if you look deeper, the mythology of this series, the fantasy world, is awfully Jewish. All the demons happen to be from Judaism. They say all religions are true, but they find themselves quoting the story of David and Jonathan and Ruth and Naomi as the really foundational stories that created their culture. And reading it, you just sense a lot of Judaism bobbing just at the surface.
Yeah. Now one of the things is, my bibliography focuses on Jewish science fiction written in English because that's what I speak. But there is a whole world out there. And a few years ago, Sheldon Teitelbaum put together an anthology that collected science fiction from Israel. And, when I read it, my first thought was, okay, it's science fiction from Israel. That means it's Jewish science fiction. But as I was reading some of the stories in it, I was realizing that wasn't entirely the case.
Yeah.
So
the book is called Zion's Fiction, Zion'', and I understand he might be working on a sequel. And I reviewed the book for, I think, Library Journal, and it was just some of the stories were just fascinating and deep, but a lot of it was, really, it felt much more like what it was, Israeli science fiction. There were a lot of metaphors in there for the Israeli experience that had not necessarily the Jewish experience. And I think that's actually something else that we should, think about it, because I think a lot of what we think of about Jewish science fiction is often based on the American Jewish science fiction experience. And probably, at least, I think for the three of us, I think we're all Ashkenazi, and there's definitely very much an Ashkenazi a slant to the way that we're looking at some of the stories or thinking about these stories.
I actually would suggest that it's not even the Jewish American experience. It probably has a lot more to do with the New York Jewish American experience. Earlier I was talking about the humorous science fiction as Borscht Belt. And we know that when science fiction was getting its start, a lot of it was coming out of Brooklyn or the upper side of New York, where you had these teenagers who would form together in groups, and a lot of them were Jewish. Asimov, of course, was one of them. Donald Woldheim was another one of them. And so they were bringing their experience and writing it as they were kind of setting the basis for what the golden age of science fiction is. They were publishing in the 30s and 40s when science fiction was first defining itself. So getting something like Zion's Fiction, the Teitelbaum edited, is very eye-opening. that there's a world out there.
It gives us a different view of what would be considered Jewish science fiction. I will say another view for me. There's a novel that I happen to enjoy, but I don't know if I can recommend it to everybody because it's incredibly sacrilegious. It's by Mike Resnick and it's called The Branch. And I don't know if I think you guys have heard of it. Basically, it's Mike Resnick's telling of the Jewish Messiah finally arrives, and it is completely not really. I mean, he hits on some very interesting points, because he got the idea from talking to somebody who was observant. Mike himself was pretty much, again, another Jewish atheist, and somehow the story of the Messianic age came up, and the guy started telling him, when the Messiah comes, it's going to be this whole, there's going to be a lot of really bad stuff happening, up to the point, who is the Messiah, and so Mike actually did some research and wrote. I guess it's sort of also a comic novel in a way. I don't know, Steve, if you would classify as one of your comic science fiction stories.
Something. It's been a while since I've read The Branch. It did not strike me as comic. I mean, yes, it's in there because it's Mike writing, and he tended to infuse everything he wrote with his sense of humor. It actually, in some ways, might be one of the more horrific stories that he's written.
Yeah, I think you may be right, but it is something that I mean, every now and then I think I've thought of, but I want to write a what is it like when the Messiah comes story, or actually I did write one, but it was a short, but it's like he has this it's a very, what he does is basically just look at the aspects of what people think in the Jewish tradition. The Messiah would have to be descended from King David, would have to set up an all-powerful kingdom. All these things that he uses to create a logical inference as to what his character does. But I mean, I would say that is very much, in a way, it's Jewish science fiction, but it's not the sort of thing I would hand somebody and say, read this, it's Jewish science fiction, if you know what I'm trying to say.
I totally get you. And actually, let's take a little bit of a break from the discussion right now and think about that. If somebody were to come up to you and say, give me a Jewish science fiction book, what would you recommend? Valerie, can you come up with a recommendation?
I mean, trillions. I would actually say go look at your list. It's ginormous. But
that doesn't really limit it.
Yeah. A book I would have loved to have as a kid, but I think it's too recent, is The Blue Thread, in which the girl is it's Sephardic fantasy from Seattle, so it's a little different. And the girl is time traveling with a magic talit, because sure, that should be a book. That should be a thing. And by the way, the second mango is LGBTQ romantic fantasy in a far-off magical land. And that one is just, again, delightful and sweet. So I'm seeing the Own Voices people really coming out with some new lovely things lately.
So that blue thread you just mentioned, I have to seek this out now. A girl traveling with a time traveling talit. All right, is that YA or is it adult? What is it?
I think it's middle grade, a little younger than YA.
I've got twin daughters. They're 11 years old. I'm going to get this.
Yeah. Okay. The one I was actually going to recommend is an alternate history, no real surprise, called The Book of Esther by Emily Barton, that postulates that the kingdom of the Khazars, which existed 1,200 years ago in the area by the Caspian Sea, manages to stay as a real country up through modern times. And they are now dealing with the Holocaust and the Nazis trying to move into their territory. And it has some wonderful, fantastic elements, all of which are based on Jewish tradition. That being said, I also want to do a shout out. Somebody posted this in the chat. They suggested the Calculating Stars and the Lady Astronaut series, which is by Mary Robinette Kowal, who is not Jewish, but her main character in this, it's now up to a trilogy of books, and there are more on the way. Her main character is Jewish, and she did an excellent job doing her research. She ran it by several readers to make sure that she got things right, and she did such a good job that I recommended it to my wife's Jewish reading group. She's in a Hadassah-based reading group. I suggested that they read the Calculating Stars. My wife read it and loved it, but she also told me that after my last suggestion for the reading group, I wasn't allowed to make any suggestions to them anymore. So unfortunately, they haven't read that. Michael, how about you? What would you recommend?
As a Jewish, like if somebody said I want to read a Jewish science fiction novel,
Somebody says I want to read a Jewish science fiction or fantasy novel. What are you going to put in their hands?
I would probably, that oddly enough, that Planet of the Jews book I mentioned before is the one I would say that I would call that in some ways a quintessential Jewish science fiction novel. It's actually a very interesting question, because I've never really thought of answering that question before that you've just posed. That's the one book that comes to mind. The only other thing that comes to mind is the book I'm in the middle of right now, which is more of a secret history, is a book called The Lost Shtetl by Max Gross, just published last year. I halfway through it, I started recommending it to people, and I'm still not done. It's about a small shtetl in Poland that has been hidden for 100 or so years, missed World War II, missed everything else, and suddenly gets discovered. And the rest of the world discovers that there's this Jewish community that's living like it's still the 19th century, early 20th century. And what Max Gross did with this book is amazing, because it's not like Brigadoon, it's not a fantasy. He actually figures out how to make this logically work. And as I read it, it's one of those books I say, yeah, everything here makes sense to me. I can see this is how this would really happen. And I think it's definitely, it's something I actually, I don't know if I could call it science fiction, maybe alternate history, but it's a book I would recommend.
Well, you recommended it to me. I got a copy of it today, so I'm looking forward to picking it up. If you've been paying attention to the conversation, if you're watching us, I certainly hope you have, you'll notice that we've talked a lot about books, but we've also talked a lot about short stories. And a lot of the really exciting things in Jewish science fiction and fantasy wind up being done in short stories. And whereas you have books like Wandering Stars that came out in 1974 and I think 1981 or 82, and you have a few more recent anthologies specifically of Jewish science fiction. People of the Book, edited by Rachel Swirsky and Sean Wallace. Clifford Meth has done two books, Strange Kaddish and Stranger Kaddish. Lavi Tidhar has done, oh God, what are they called? Aliens, and one's on
aliens versus Jews versus aliens.
Jews versus aliens and Jews versus
zombies.
But frequently you find excellent Jewish short stories in unexpected places. I mentioned a story by Valerie Freire about Vashti, because we are in Purim season, that appeared in Susan Schwartz's anthology, Sisters of Fantasy 2. And one of my favorite Jewish science fiction stories is by P.D. Kasich. It's called I'm thinking People of the Book, but I don't think that's right. Hold on, give me a second. P.D. Kasich's A Book by Its Cover, which originally appeared in an anthology called Shelf Life, that unfortunately, if I told you about it, aside from that it's a Holocaust story, anything I told you about it would totally destroy the story. It has unfortunately not been reprinted, but if you ever have a chance to read it, I highly recommend it. So, Michael, Valerie, where else would you recommend people go searching for these?
ISFDB, the science fiction database, is good for just, I know the name of the story and the author, but how many collections has it been reprinted in? Because if it's like an Asimov short story, sometimes the answer is 20 collections, so you could go find it.
I would say that if you use social media, there are a variety of groups out there that will help. There are people who know Jewish science fiction and fantasy stories. There's groups on Facebook that you could go searching for things, and there will be people who will know and be able to point you towards stories. But you're right, because part of it is that sometimes it's science fiction story. Asimov's analog, FNSF would have published stories that had Jewish themes, and just like they'll publish stories with any other theme, but you won't necessarily know until you pick it up and read the story. It's like, it's not, as you say, it's different from having a specific book that is dedicated to Jewish stories. You look at, as you mentioned, Mary Robinette Cowell's books, the titles don't say anything in them to make you say, hey, this is a Jewish story. It's something you have to be told about.
Right, and in the bibliography I have online, I list generally the first published appearance, which isn't necessarily helpful in finding the story if you're trying to track it down. So use that in conjunction with ISFDB to find where it may have been reprinted. The other thing is at Boscombe every year, which is a science fiction convention in Boston, there is a Jewish science fiction panel. And it is at Boston, right? Not Aresia?
Well, actually, the one I moderated was at Aresia a few
Okay.
years ago, but we did it like 2 or 3 years in a row, and then we're taking a break from it for a bit.
So, but there is a Facebook group that's dedicated to that also, where people discuss what was said at the last panel and kind of continue the conversation. And you can always try to find me. You can email me through my website if you have questions about it, and I can try to help track something down if I don't already have it listed.
Stephen?
Yeah.
Before we go to the Q&A, because I think we're getting to that point.
Yeah.
I just wanted to mention two things that I think most of our audience may be or may not be aware of this. But just one thing, I want to remind people that a few years back there was this fascinating article, and I think the New York Review of Books or a place about the question of why isn't there a Jewish Narnia. Right. And we don't really have a lot of time to talk about that, but I recommend people read it. It's interesting because it does provide the interesting question of why do Jewish writers or Jewish stories to be more science fiction than fantasy? And I would like to point out that there is a very nice fanfic out there that a person started writing in which they take the character of Anthony Goldstein from the Harry Potter books, and they turn him into a yeshiva bucher and make it all about how is he managing to keep kosher and all this other stuff at Hogwarts. And I wish I remember the title of the story. The writer goes by Lazov, Laazov. And if I can remember the title, I will send it out. But the second thing I also want to point out is that some of the stories that people write is also a game that a lot of us play who are Jewish, which is to think about how halacha will adapt to technology. I mean, this has happened historically. Electricity didn't exist the way we use it now when we were, when halacha was first, out there, and then electricity was there, and suddenly you had all these people arguing. A few years ago, I brought to my rabbi the question, or to a rabbi, the question of, vat meat. Was it going to be kosher or not? And I actually asked I did ask my rabbi, can I use a time machine to skip Pesach and not have to worry about doing any of the prep for Pesach? And he actually gave me a serious answer, even though he knew I didn't have a time machine.
Right. So, okay, Valerie, we have a couple moments left before we get to the question and answer. Do you have anything you would like to say in conclusion?
The very short answer to is there a Jewish Narnia, I would say, is in the last decade or couple, authors have been younger and more comfortable, less exposed to prejudice, and I've been seeing more Jewish Narnias pop up, possibly after that article.
So okay, well, we are now at the question and answer time. So Trillian, I'm going to invite you back in to start feeding us questions.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating. Just very quickly, so my colleague and I have been trying to keep up with all of the links, which is why you'll see there's a couple of them in there more than once. So a couple of things. One, we will stick around and make sure that everyone has time to grab the links they would like. A lot of what we've spoken about already is included in a brilliant reading list that together Stephen, Michael and Valerie were able to put together for us, that's now up on our website, and so you can have a look at it there. So we're going to drop a link for that into the chat. There it is, I think, already. And then that also contains, but we're going to do them again there for you now as well, links to both websites for Valerie, Michael and Stephen, and links to some of their works that you can read as well. So all of that is going into the Q&A now, going into the chat for you now. We'll likely share that again at the end, because I know that there's a lot of chat going on, which is brilliant. So hopefully making it easier for everyone to find the links that they would like. But if you only get one, get that one to our page, and that's got basically everything you need on it. Okay, so right, I think we probably have to start at the bottom of the list of Q&A because it will make sense. Someone in the audience would like to know, can we use a time machine to skip Passover or not?
So you want the answer that my rabbi gave me?
You can come up with your own. You can come up with your own answer.
Oh, okay. Well, no. Well, first of all, I will tell you, as always, consult your own local halachic authority, or as we say in the Orthodox movement, LOR, your local Orthodox rabbi. I cannot give you a ruling. I am not a rabbi. Now, that said, My rabbi told me I was not allowed to use a time machine to skip Pesach because you're not supposed to run away from doing a mitzvah. So I am taking this into consideration, and if I ever do have a time machine, I guess I will not skip Pesach with it. But he did not answer the question. I said, can you travel away from Shabbat or into Shabbat in your time machine? And he thought about it. He didn't do any research on this one, but he said that he thought using magic to time travel on Shabbat would be okay, using science would not, but you really can't use magic. So I don't really have an answer to that question.
Okay,
but no, you cannot skip Pesach.
For this particular question, though, I have some information that you're missing, Michael.
Oh, what am I missing?
And that is the person who asked for the explanation is my brother-in-law, and I'm pretty sure he's trying to avoid joining me for Seder this year. So, Alex, the answer is no, you can't use a time machine. You have to show up for the Seder.
Can you use COVID, maybe? Does that one work?
We could do it via Zoom. That's what we did last year.
That's true. That's true.
I will say a few years ago, I did ask a rabbi for how to observe Jewish holidays on Mars, because I was writing a story that never got published that I was doing that. And he actually did some research and he gave me a ruling. You'll love this. He said to me, Michael, this is a ruling for you, for your characters in your novel. If you're ever actually going to travel to Mars, you have to come back to me so I can do more research to give you another ruling. So I found that very interesting. Anyway.
Okay, Valerie, someone wanted to follow up with you on your examples of Jewish Narnia stories. Is that something you can help us with, please?
If you email me, I can give you a big list, but like Michael Chabon not only did Yiddish Policeman Union, but also a kid goes to a magical world based on baseball, Summerland, that just had a very Jewish feel to it. I mentioned City of Bones, likewise Lee Bardugo's stuff, which is about to be adapted into TV, also has a very subtle with the prejudice and so forth, some of the concepts there. And again, just something like The Last Mango, where the fantasy world just is all Jews. Yeah, they're showing up.
Thank you. Okay, we've got a question here from, I think, Scott. Would the panel consider Stanley Elkin to be a Jewish science fiction fantasy writer, though considered more mainstream author? His works, such as The Living End and others, always had the individual thinking that he might be Jewish.
Scott, I think the thing here is it's not a matter of are they a Jewish science fiction writer. I think that's a red herring. Is this particular story that you're looking at, is that a Jewish science fiction story? And as we said earlier, Jewish science fiction writers, Michael, me, Valerie, anybody, can write a story that is Jewish science fiction or is not Jewish science fiction. And it's on a story by story basis. And non-Jewish authors can write stories that are Jewish as well. So you really have to look at it from a story by story basis to determine if it's a Jewish science fiction story. So obviously, no matter what I write, I'm a Jewish science fiction writer. No matter what Michael writes, he's a Jewish science fiction author. So it's just, is the story Jewish science fiction is what we're trying to delve into. How's that for a non-answer?
Okay, let's follow up then. There's another question. Someone has asked about what your thoughts are of the work of, and I'm sorry, I'm not going to say this right, Lavi Tidhar. Is that right?
That works.
He's been creating so much. Israeli, I think he's living in England last I checked, but very, very Israeli science fiction, Jews in space, what if we create the space station and so forth. And he edited Jews versus Zombies. So just a lot of the Israeli stuff I'm seeing is from him.
I would, if anyone wants to, hasn't heard of him yet, you want to get started on his work, I recommend Hebrew Punk. That's the title. It's a collection of, I think, 4 of his short stories. They're all Jewish supernatural themes. So
yeah,
he's the guy who put together those books we mentioned before, Jews versus Aliens, right, and Jews versus Zombies.
Right, and he also
on the
did,
reading list.
is it called the Bookseller? Was one of his, I think. So yeah, Lavi has a lot of stuff out there, and it's all worth picking up and reading.
Thank you.
Oh, if I could just mention, I didn't put this on the list. Maybe I'll try to find you the link, Trillia, but I actually wrote a Jews versus vampire story that Mike Resnick published and then got picked up by John Joseph Adams for a vampire collection. And it's called Lifeblood. And it's a fascinating story to me because it reminds me of the story Asimov used to tell when after he wrote Nightfall, that he went to hear a lecture, and this professor gave this whole talk about his story Nightfall, claiming there were all these elements of the story that Asimov had never intended to put in there. And after the lecture, Asimov goes up to him and says, you know, none of that stuff that you said was in Nightfall is really in there. And the professor said, how do you know? And he says, well, I'm the author. And he says, you're Isaac Asimov, you wrote Nightfall? Well, just because you wrote it, what makes you think you know everything that's in it? And I have found when I go and I reread this particular story, Lifeblood, that there's things in there I had never realized were in there. So,
and the amazing thing is, there is a subcategory of Jewish vampire stories. Harry Turtledove wrote A Different Vein, and Adam Troy Castro wrote The Curse of the Flempire.
And there's a Marvel comic, Greenberg the Vampire, I think it's called, which should also, yeah. I mean, I'll say we're talking about science fiction. You know, this panel could be twice as long to bring in superheroes and comic books and the Jewish writers and creators. So let's not. You got another question?
Another question. Yes. Okay, we're going back to that one. Right. Would Exodus-inspired stories be considered Jewish, or would you have recommendations for more Jewish-inspired Exodus stories, as many stories can be related to that when they come to migration stories?
There are so many Adam and Eve based sci-fi, that's a whole genre, just Adam and Eve spin-offs. And yes, Exodus and some of the other ones, Noah's Ark, that's a whole genre. So I find I have to do those on a case-by-case basis because some really are and some really aren't.
I think you might have to look at the exegesis on some of those, you know, meaning, did the person write, if somebody writes an Exodus style story, did they put Jewish thought or themes into it, or did they put maybe Christian thoughts or themes into it? You know, and it's an interesting question that you won't necessarily know what the resonances are. I saw an essay somebody wrote claiming that I don't think it's too much of a spoiler to talk about the Marvel movie Thor Ragnarok, the one in which like all of the gods on the planet have to flee, and they're on their own little exodus. And somebody had this claim that there was a Jewish story about the Norse gods. Yeah, okay, whatever.
Well, and again, it's a case-by-case basis. Some are going to be Jewish themed. Bob Silverbird's To the Promised Land, for instance, definitely a Jewish Exodus story. Others aren't. Just because we have the Exodus doesn't mean that we own the Exodus. Other cultures have Exodus as well. They may call it something else, but you know, I was reading an article about the Indian diaspora the other day. You know, everybody has to flee their homeland at some time.
If I could give one example from science fiction, I don't want us to get too political, but I'll just note that the Bajorans on Star Trek, and especially in Star Trek Deep Space Nine, The Next Generation, there are some people who look at the Bajorans as being the Jews fleeing from, having no home. There are some who drew an analogy and looked at the Bajorans as being like the Palestinians in the areas near Israel. So, I find it interesting that sometimes, we have stories that we might consider Jewish or Jewish themes, but as Stephen said, as Valerie pointed out, they might be connected to another culture in their own way that we may not even be realizing. And they may not even be realizing that we're bringing something Jewish to it.
Okay, I think we're sort of going back to our Passover conversation a little bit. How do you determine when sunset is in space and thus when Shabbat starts? And I'm wondering if I can put in a really, really quick plug because we did a program on this last summer. So Laura, hopefully you can pull up the link to that, where we did have Rabbi Yogev, who's based in Baltimore, do a presentation on that. But maybe you guys can give the science fiction answer to that question. Or perhaps if you already asked your rabbi, you can also answer.
Well, the science fiction answer, honestly, is whatever works best for the story you're trying to tell.
That's fair.
So what I want to say, first of all, I want to tell everybody all of the programs that the Jewish Museum of Maryland have been doing for this Jews in Space thing have been great. I've been attending a whole bunch of them. I'm loving them, and I encourage you to check out the recordings, look at more of them. And even though the tickets are free, a donation would be a mitzvah. So go look at the one the rabbi did. Now that said, we actually have a thing in Judaism that talks about this time issue. And in fact, my father-in-law did this years ago. He was sent by his job to go up to Alaska, and he found himself in a place in Alaska where the sun doesn't set. And my father-in-law had to talk to his rabbi about, when does he observe Shabbat? What do you do? And apparently there's some very interesting answers to that. If there's already an established Jewish community, you follow what they do. Or if you might trace down a line of longitude to the first major Jewish community and follow their time. Or you might follow Jerusalem time, but transferred to where you are. So if Shabbat starts at 6 p.m. in Jerusalem and you're in Barrow, Alaska, you would wait until it's 6 p.m. there. But we have, or you might even just do it where your home is. You might say, follow the Shabbat times of your home because you're only dwelling here temporarily. So we actually already have a whole, and this is all already like rabbis discussing, it's in the Talmud, that can be applied to the question of observing Shabbat in space.
Right. And we've had Jewish astronauts who have had to deal with this. And, we know that their Shabbat lasts longer than 90 minutes that it takes for them to do, one rotation around the Earth. Mm-hmm. But a lot of it also has to depend on which rabbi you talk to. My rabbi is going to give you one answer. Valerie's rabbi is going to give you a different answer. Michael's rabbi is going to give you a third and a fourth answer, I think, as we've discovered. So
I think there's occasionally been situations where two Jews have gotten two different answers and find themselves together in a far, like in a far north place, and have started and ended their Shabbat at different times. Yep. And if you ever want to really annoy your rabbi, tell them that you're flying across the international date line over Tisha B'Av, and can you skip the fast, but you don't want to fast for 48 hours, what do you do? And I'll tell you, what every rabbi does when you tell them you're flying over the international date line at Tisha B'Av, the first thing they say to you is, don't do that. And then when you tell them you're going to, they go to their library and find an answer for you. But
yeah. Thank you. Okay, I think we've got one last question here. When is Lightspeed going to do a Jews Destroy science fiction issue?
I don't think that John Joseph Adams has any intention on doing that. And one of the reasons is the Destroys, the X Group Destroy Science Fiction series has really been focused on getting works by marginalized authors into print. And whereas Jews are definitely a minority in the wide world, we don't have the minority feel, and we don't feel like a minority within science fiction. And so doing a Jews Destroy Science Fiction issue, I think, goes against just the purpose of those issues.
I have to agree with Stephen. It's a very interesting question. It reminds me of I forget the writer's name, but he wrote Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, in which he basically said that the Israelis need to think of themselves as both the majority and the minority in different situations. And yes, as a subset of the population of the world, we are definitely a minority. But as a group that has influenced the surrounding culture, especially in the world of science fiction, I would say that we are, well, I wouldn't say we're a majority, but I would say we are definitely, our voices have not been silenced. Let's put it that way.
And using that, I want to jump off and do yet another plug for Valerie's forthcoming book, because that's exactly the type of thing that Valerie looks at in the book that she has coming out.
I will also, I will agree with Stephen. I'm actually going to recommend Valerie's books, because even before this panel, before I actually met her here, I've been reading a whole bunch of her books, and they're really good. So,
Valerie, what's the title of the book that you have coming up?
I was hoping people wouldn't ask.
Sorry.
I just don't happen to remember this second. It's something like The Golden Age of Jewish Science Fiction. It's a whole series on Jewish science fiction and fantasy coming from Lexington Press. and it's covering all the eras and all the books.
We're just about to put Valerie's website link into the chat. So to save you that, Valerie, everyone can go and look at Valerie's website and explore all of the amazing books that she has written, and the newest one as well.
And Trillian, I would just like to say one other thing, a little self-serving, but I am actually been discussing with a particular publisher who I'm not allowed to name yet, that we might be doing a Kickstarter for a new anthology of Jewish science fiction stories later in this year. I don't know if and when it's actually going to happen, but we were talking about it last year, 2 years, and then the pandemic hit. So we will see. But if that does happen, it's really not that hard to find me on Twitter or Facebook, like yelling from the rooftop announcements and things like that.
So I think with that, we are just about out of time. As promised, we're going to start dropping some links back into the chat. So we'll drop the link for that general reading list, and then the links where you can read more, both in terms of sort of general projects and actual pieces written by Valerie, Michael, and Stephen. In addition to that, I just want to follow up on a couple of things that have come up during the program. So the JMM does have copies of Wandering Stars available for purchase through our museum store at almost the exact same price as Amazon right now, which I feel is important. And any purchases from our store really do go a long way to support the museum. So I encourage you to have a little look there if you're thinking about purchasing a copy of that book. I also want to just take a moment to mention that we will be back the same time next week for our next program, Can Elephants Jump? A different look at science, the Talmud, and Judaism. The link should be going to register for that program into the chat right now. And then finally, I just wanted to touch upon, we do have a lot of recordings of the programs that we've been able to do over the last few months. And it would be wonderful if you wanted to go and have a little look. One of them that we would especially love to direct you to, in addition to the ones you've heard about earlier today, we welcomed back in October Mark Okrand, the inventor of Klingon, and it was just a brilliant presentation and well worth having a look at. So as I said earlier, we'll stick around for a bit so you can get all of those links. I know there are a lot of them this evening. As a reminder, as you leave the program today, you'll be directed to a survey. It would be wonderful if you could take a moment to fill that out and just let us know your thoughts about the program. And then just to wrap us up, I'd like to say thank you to Laura, who's been in the background finding a lot of the links for us. And also a massive thank you to Valerie, Michael, and Stephen for joining us for just such a fascinating conversation and taking us through a brilliant subject. So thank you very much. Have a wonderful evening, and I hope we see you back here very, very soon. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.